Dr. Clare Craig, a pathologist and co-chair of HEART, did a video translating into plain English Pfizer's own data for infants 6 months to 4 years old. YouTube instantly zapped it as medical misinformation, which is a badge of honor from these sick control freaks. Dr. Craig joins me now. And Clare, just lay it out to us. What is the science that says a 6-month-old needs to get a COVID vaccine?
I mean, there is no science that says that. And HEART have been campaigning for 18 months around children and young people not being vaccinated against COVID. At the very outset, you might remember that Kate Bingham was clear that this vaccine was not to be used in the young, and Matt Hancock reiterated her words in the House of Commons. And yet, here we are. It's quite unbelievable that it's progressed this far, and yet sort of we could almost always see it coming. But I can't quite grasp the fact that there are serious people who are serious about injecting babies who are not at risk from COVID. You know, the risk, if a child under 5 catches COVID, then the chance of a death with COVID is 1 in 250,000 at its worst. That's kind of worst case scenario sum. And that's, you're talking about sort of, you know, being struck by lightning type odds. And because it's not a risk, when they were doing the trial, they couldn't measure it. But, you know, that you shouldn't be doing a trial where you can't measure the benefit. But that's the situation that we were in.
That's actually a very important point, because what you're saying is that because there is no medical issue here, as it were, you can't really measure the results. Because, I mean, I've known families that have had COVID, and the youngest kids always just have a couple of, you know, it can clobber the mum and the dad, but the youngest kids just have a couple of sniffly days and then that's it. So you're saying that you can't even conduct a medical trial on these things because there is no medical issue that this vaccine, so-called, it can actually solve. It'd be like you know, it's like giving a cancer drug to someone who doesn't have the disease.
Almost. So what Pfizer did is they set out their own rules for how they would do this trial. So they said at the beginning, and it is in black and white in their opening paragraph, that even though there is no antibody level that can guarantee protection from this virus, they would use an antibody level measurement as the outcome for these tiny children. So what they said, the rules that they set were, if they could prove that these children had a raise in antibody levels that was equivalent to what was seen in other trials for older people, then that would be enough. So they did that. They only tested 10% of the children for antibody levels, which in itself is unethical. You know, recruiting thousands of children and ignoring the results in most of them. And then after 2 doses, which is what they set out to do, they found antibodies to Wuhan, which is what the vaccine stimulates. It's the Wuhan spike in the vaccine. But there were no antibodies to the Omicron spike, none at all, 0. So they went back to the drawing board, changed the goalpost and said, well, we'll add in a 3rd dose in that case. And they did. So they brought the children back again and jabbed them again. And then they decided that they would look at the outcome a week after that 3rd dose and see if they could spot a benefit. Now, what that means is that the first 3 weeks between the 1st dose and the 2nd dose, they ignored all of the COVID. Now, in that period, the vaccinated children were getting COVID 30% more often than the unvaccinated children. This is a sort of danger zone time that they had to pass through. They then ignored all of the COVID after the 2nd dose before the 3rd dose and the first week after the 3rd dose. And it amounted to ignoring 97% of the COVID. And then they found after this week, after the 3rd dose, there were 10 cases of COVID. And they used those 10 cases of COVID to present to the FDA claiming 80% efficacy because of the difference between the groups. Now, in their own rules, they had said they wouldn't even look at the data until they had 21 cases after the third dose. But after 10 cases, they're like, oh, wow, we've seen a tiny, tiny difference. Let's get this in front of the FDA while we can before it disappears. And they did. That's exactly what they did. So they presented this ridiculous, embarrassing, like complete nonsense statistics based on these teeny tiny numbers as if it was a genuine thing. And the FDA bought it. I mean, that's the other side of this story. If you had a committee on the FDA who voted unanimously that this should be approved as an emergency use authorization, which means that it will prevent serious injury or death. That's the criteria for emergency use authorization, and every single one of them voted for it. Even though there are regulators elsewhere in the world who have said Moderna shouldn't be used in the under 30s. So there is absolutely uncertainty here, and that there was no uncertainty in that committee, which is just incredibly odd.
Setting aside COVID, are you worried that we're basically corrupting all the basic terms of science and medicine now? The term vaccine, it's dubious whether that should even be applied to these things. I just quoted the thing they say now, the new ethical standard, it's safe for most people. So if it kills 49% of you, tough. And now all the basic accepted norms of trials are being discarded in order to achieve the desired results. This is going to have consequences way beyond COVID, isn't it?
Yes, the corruption of the language disturbs me immensely. So the definition of a vaccine was an intervention that prevented infection. And that is the definition that the public still understands that word to represent. And yet they just sort of change the rules, change the goalposts as if that doesn't matter. And the definition now is it's something that increases immunity, which is, much harder to pin down, much harder to understand if you're a member of the public. And there are other words that have also been, abused in a similar manner. And yes, I agree that, the rules have shifted, but my hope is that because this trial was just so ridiculously bad, and because it's an issue that affects a lot of people, there will be enough scientists out there, with young children who will be looking at it properly, whose jaws will be on the floor. So just unbelievable that this is now accepted as in any way meaningful, and people will start to wake up, because there is no interpretation of this evidence that is benign. It's just ridiculously clear that this is, this has gone wrong. The system has gone wrong. The regulator is not working.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that, Clare Craig. And we're going to stay on top of this because a lot of the other radio and TV operations in the UK are not staying on top of it.